Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're exploring something that touches many of our lives in profound ways: the psychological bonds we form with our companion animals, and how these relationships intersect with our capacity to heal, grieve, and find emotional regulation. I've been thinking about this topic for quite some time, particularly as I've witnessed how people navigate loss and trauma. There's something almost miraculous about the way a dog might sense when we're having a difficult day, or how a cat seems to appear just when we need that quiet, grounding presence. But what's really happening here? What does the science tell us about these bonds that feel so intuitive, so necessary to our well being? Let's start with something fundamental. These aren't just casual relationships we're talking about. The research reveals that the bonds we form with companion animals mirror the same psychological and neurobiological mechanisms that govern our most important human relationships. It's grounded in what John Bowlby called attachment theory, which describes bonds characterized by proximity seeking, separation distress, and the use of the attachment figure as both a secure base and safe haven. When I say this, I don't mean we should anthropomorphize our relationships with animals or treat them exactly like human relationships. Rather, I'm suggesting that our brains and hearts don't always distinguish between the source of comfort and security. The same neural pathways that light up when we feel connected to a loved one can activate when we're with our companion animals. Think about it this way: attachment isn't really about the species of the attachment figure. It's about predictability, responsiveness, and emotional availability. Your dog who greets you at the door every day, who seems to know when you need comfort, who provides that steady, non judgmental presence. These are the building blocks of secure attachment, regardless of whether we're talking about a human or an animal. The neurobiological systems underlying these bonds are fascinating and, frankly, quite similar to human attachment. We're seeing involvement of oxytocin and dopamine, those reward and bonding chemicals, as well as the endogenous opioid system that helps regulate our emotional responses. When someone tells me their pet helps them feel calmer or more grounded, there's actual biochemistry supporting that experience. But here's where it gets interesting, and perhaps more complex than we might initially assume. Early experiences with caregivers shape what researchers call internal working models, essentially mental templates for how relationships work, how trustworthy others are, and how deserving we are of care and attention. These templates don't just apply to human relationships, they influence how we bond with animals too. For some people, particularly those who experienced inconsistent or unreliable caregiving early in life, animals might serve as what we could call corrective attachment experiences. Animals, especially dogs, tend to be more consistent in their responses than humans. They don't have bad days where they withdraw emotionally. They don't carry grudges or engage in the complex social dynamics that can make human relationships challenging for someone with attachment wounds. This isn't to suggest that animal relationships are somehow superior or that they should replace human connections. Rather, they can serve as a bridge, a way to experience secure attachment patterns that might then generalize to human relationships. It's almost like emotional physical therapy, practicing the muscle memory of trust and secure connection in a slightly safer context. Now, one of the most robust findings in this research is what we might call the stress buffer effect. Companion animals seem particularly effective at helping us regulate our emotions during difficult periods. This isn't just wishful thinking or projection. We can measure this in multiple ways, from self reported mood improvements to actual cortisol level changes. During the COVID-19 pandemic, researchers had an unfortunate natural experiment to study this phenomenon. People were isolated, anxious, dealing with unprecedented levels of uncertainty and loss. What they found was that companion animals provided significant protection against increases in loneliness, depression, and anxiety during lockdown periods. The animals didn't eliminate these challenges, but they seemed to prevent them from becoming as severe as they might have otherwise been. But here's what I find particularly compelling about this research: the benefits aren't uniform. The strength and quality of the human animal bond matters tremendously. A perfunctory relationship with a pet doesn't provide the same benefits as a deeply connected, mutually attuned relationship. This suggests that it's not just about having an animal present, it's about the quality of the emotional connection. For people working through grief, whether that's the loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, a major life transition, or even anticipatory grief as we watch someone we love decline, companion animals can serve multiple therapeutic functions. They provide routine and structure when our world feels chaotic. They offer non judgmental companionship when we feel isolated in our pain. They can be a reason to get up, to go outside, to maintain some semblance of self care when everything else feels pointless. I think about this concept of adaptive emotional regulation that appears in the research. For individuals who struggle with intense emotions, whether that's the rage that sometimes accompanies grief, the overwhelming sadness, or the numbness that can feel even worse than pain, animals can serve as emotional co regulators. They don't try to fix our feelings or offer platitudes. They simply exist alongside our emotional experience, providing a kind of grounding presence. This is particularly powerful for people who experience trauma or who have what researchers call high trait anger. The animal relationship can serve as practice for healthy emotional regulation without the complexity and potential triggers that human relationships might involve, at least initially. Something that continues to amaze both researchers and pet owners is the extent to which animals, particularly dogs, can detect and respond to human emotional states. We're not talking about simple behavioral cues here, though those certainly play a role. We're talking about what appears to be genuine emotional contagion, where animals physiologically mirror our emotional states. Studies have shown that dogs' cortisol levels rise in response to human distress. Their heart rate variability changes when their humans are stressed. They exhibit behavioral changes, increased alertness, proximity seeking, sometimes vocalizations, when they detect emotional distress in their human companions. This creates what I think of as a feedback loop of emotional attunement. The human feels distressed, the animal senses this and responds with comfort seeking or comfort providing behavior, which can help regulate the human's emotional state, which then helps the animal return to baseline. It's a co regulatory process that mirrors what happens in secure human relationships, but it might be more accessible for people who struggle with human connection. Now, this emotional attunement isn't universal across all animals. Dogs, having been selectively bred for thousands of years to work cooperatively with humans, seem particularly adept at this kind of emotional reading. Cats can certainly form deep bonds with their humans, but their responses might be more subtle or expressed differently. Other companion animals, rabbits, birds, even some reptiles, can form meaningful relationships with humans, but the degree of emotional mirroring might be less pronounced. What's fascinating is that this emotional sensitivity appears to strengthen over time and with familiarity. Dogs who have been with their families longer show stronger physiological responses to their humans' emotional states. This suggests that, like human relationships, these bonds deepen and become more attuned over time. For people dealing with grief, this emotional attunement can be profoundly comforting. Grief can be an isolating experience, partly because our culture doesn't always know how to respond to intense emotion. People might avoid us when we're grieving, or offer well meaning but ultimately unhelpful advice about moving on or finding closure. Animals don't do this. They don't try to fix our feelings or hurry us through our process. They simply bear witness to our emotional experience with a kind of patient presence that can feel deeply healing. But we need to acknowledge that these relationships aren't always straightforward or uniformly beneficial. The research reveals some important nuances that I think are crucial to understand, particularly for people who might be struggling with loss or emotional regulation. Strong attachment to pets can sometimes signal underlying psychological vulnerability or distress. This doesn't mean that loving your pet deeply is pathological, not at all. But for some individuals, particularly intense bonds with animals might serve as a way of avoiding or compensating for difficulties in human relationships. I think about this as a spectrum. On one end, you have healthy, secure attachment to companion animals that enhances overall well being and complements human relationships. On the other end, you might have what researchers call compensatory attachment, where the animal relationship becomes a substitute for human connection rather than a supplement to it. The key distinction seems to be whether the animal relationship enhances your capacity for connection overall, or whether it becomes a way of avoiding the challenges and vulnerabilities that come with human relationships. Both can provide comfort and emotional regulation, but they lead to different long term outcomes in terms of overall social and emotional health. For people working through grief, this distinction can be particularly important. Grief is fundamentally relational. We grieve because we've lost connection with someone who mattered to us. While a companion animal can provide crucial support during this process, if the animal relationship becomes a way of avoiding the vulnerability required to form new human connections, it might actually impede the grief process rather than support it. This isn't about judgment, it's about awareness. Sometimes, particularly in the acute phases of grief or trauma, we need whatever sources of comfort and stability we can find. A deep bond with a companion animal might be exactly what someone needs to survive a difficult period, but over time, as healing progresses, it might be worth examining whether these relationships are opening us up to greater connection or helping us avoid it. The research also reveals that the benefits of companion animals are often most pronounced during periods of stress or crisis. During everyday, low stress situations, the effects might be less noticeable. This makes sense from a psychological perspective. These relationships seem to serve particularly important functions as emotional buffers and sources of comfort during difficult times. We can't have a conversation about human animal bonds without acknowledging one of the most challenging aspects of these relationships, their inevitable end. Companion animals typically have shorter lifespans than humans, which means that loving them often involves accepting the reality of loss. The grief that follows the death of a beloved companion animal is real and can be profound. Yet our culture often doesn't recognize this type of loss as legitimate. People might hear things like, "It was just a dog," or "You can always get another one." Responses that completely miss the depth and significance of these relationships. From a psychological perspective, pet loss grief involves all the same processes as any other significant loss. There's the shock and denial, the bargaining, the anger, the deep sadness, and eventually, for most people, some form of acceptance and integration. But pet loss grief also has some unique characteristics that are worth understanding. First, there's often what I call anticipatory complicated grief around pet loss. Because we know that our companion animals will likely predecease us, we might find ourselves grieving the future loss even while they're still healthy. Every birthday, every sign of aging can trigger awareness of the inevitable goodbye. This anticipatory grief can add a layer of complexity to the relationship, sometimes making people hesitant to fully invest emotionally. Second, pet loss often involves difficult decisions about end of life care that can compound the grief. Unlike human death, which usually occurs naturally or is managed by medical professionals, pet death often involves active decisions about euthanasia. This can create complicated feelings of responsibility, guilt, and second guessing that can complicate the grief process. Third, the social support for pet loss is often inadequate. While people might get bereavement leave for the death of a human family member, they're unlikely to receive the same accommodation for pet loss. This can leave people feeling isolated in their grief and hesitant to seek support. But perhaps most significantly, pet loss can trigger what researchers call disenfranchised grief, grief that's not socially recognized or supported. When the relationship was particularly important for emotional regulation or served as a primary source of companionship, the loss can be devastating, but the griever might not feel entitled to the depth of their feelings. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for supporting people through pet loss. The grief is proportional to the significance of the relationship, not to cultural expectations about which relationships should matter. For someone whose companion animal served as their primary source of emotional comfort and regulation, the loss can be as destabilizing as the death of any other significant attachment figure. What does all of this mean for how we approach healing, therapy, and emotional well being? I think there are several important implications that emerge from this research. First, we need to take these relationships seriously in therapeutic contexts. When someone mentions their companion animal, it's worth exploring the nature and significance of that relationship. For some people, their pet might be their most secure attachment relationship, their primary source of emotional regulation, or their main motivation for self care. Understanding this can inform treatment approaches and help identify both resources and potential vulnerabilities. Second, we might consider how to incorporate awareness of human animal bonds into therapeutic work. This doesn't necessarily mean bringing animals into therapy sessions, though animal assisted therapy certainly has its place. It might mean exploring how someone's relationship with their pet reflects their broader attachment patterns, or helping someone understand how their pet serves important emotional regulation functions. For people working through grief, exploring the role that companion animals play or have played can be particularly valuable. Sometimes people feel guilty about finding more comfort in their pet than in human relationships. Understanding this as a normal and potentially adaptive response can reduce shame and open up space for healing. Third, we need to prepare people for the reality of pet loss and provide adequate support when it occurs. This might involve helping people think through their animal's aging process, discussing end of life decisions before they become urgent, and ensuring that pet loss grief is recognized and supported appropriately. I think there's also something to be learned from these relationships about the nature of healing itself. Companion animals don't try to fix us or hurry us through difficult emotions. They don't offer advice or attempt to problem solve our distress. They simply offer consistent presence, non judgmental acceptance, and reliable comfort. There's something profound in this approach that might inform how we show up for people who are struggling. Sometimes the most healing thing we can offer is not solutions or insights, but simply steady, reliable presence alongside someone's emotional experience. The neurobiological research on human animal bonds offers some fascinating insights into why these relationships can be so healing. When we interact with a beloved companion animal, our brains release oxytocin, the same hormone involved in human bonding, childbirth, and maternal attachment. This isn't just a feel good chemical. Oxytocin has actual stress reducing and healing properties. At the same time, these interactions can lower cortisol levels, reduce blood pressure, and activate the parasympathetic nervous system, essentially shifting us out of fight or flight mode and into a state that's more conducive to healing and emotional processing. For people who have experienced trauma, this physiological regulation can be particularly important. Trauma often leaves the nervous system in a state of chronic hyperactivation, making it difficult to feel safe and calm. The predictable, non threatening presence of a beloved animal can help signal to the nervous system that it's safe to relax, creating space for healing to occur. The bilateral nature of many animal relationships, the fact that caring for an animal involves both giving and receiving comfort, might also contribute to their therapeutic value. For people who struggle with feelings of worthlessness or who have difficulty accepting care from others, having an animal who depends on them can provide a sense of purpose and value, While the animal's affection can provide an acceptable way to receive nurturing, this reciprocal nature is particularly important for understanding how these relationships support people through grief and depression. When someone is struggling with motivation or self care, having an animal who needs daily feeding, walking, or attention can provide structure and purpose that might otherwise be lacking. As we think about the therapeutic potential of human animal relationships, we need to acknowledge that these bonds aren't universal or uniformly positive for everyone. Cultural background, individual personality, past experiences with animals, and current life circumstances all influence how someone might relate to companion animals. Some cultures have very different relationships with animals than others. What feels healing and natural to one person might feel foreign or uncomfortable to another. Some individuals have phobias or allergies that make animal relationships impractical. Others might have traumatic histories with animals that complicate these bonds. We also need to recognize that not all human animal relationships are healthy. Just as human relationships can become codependent, controlling, or otherwise dysfunctional, so can relationships with animals. Animal hoarding, for instance, often involves complicated attachment dynamics where the person's need to care for animals overwhelms their capacity to actually provide good care. The key is understanding each person's unique relationship to animals and how it fits into their broader pattern of attachment and emotional regulation. For some people, a companion animal might be exactly what they need to support their healing process. For others, human relationships or other forms of comfort and connection might be more appropriate. As we wrap up today's exploration, I want to leave you with some thoughts about how we might integrate this understanding into our daily lives and our approaches to healing. First, if you have a companion animal, take a moment to appreciate the complexity and significance of that relationship. These aren't just pets, they're partners in our emotional lives, sources of comfort and regulation, and teachers in the art of presence and acceptance. Second, if you don't currently have an animal companion but are curious about whether one might benefit your well being, consider what you're hoping for from that relationship. Are you looking for companionship, structure, motivation for self care, or emotional comfort? Understanding your motivations can help guide decisions about what type of animal might be appropriate and whether you're in a life situation that would support that relationship well. Third, if you're supporting someone through grief or emotional difficulty, don't underestimate the significance of their relationship with their companion animals. These bonds can be sources of immense comfort and stability, and they deserve to be recognized and supported. Finally, whether or not animals are part of your personal healing journey, there's something to learn from the quality of presence that animals offer. They don't try to fix or change us. They don't judge our emotions or hurry us through difficult experiences. They simply show up consistently and reliably, offering comfort through their presence. There's a model here for how we might show up for ourselves and others during difficult times. Sometimes the most healing thing isn't advice or solutions, but simply the willingness to be present with whatever is happening without trying to change or fix it. The research we've explored today suggests that our capacity for healing and emotional regulation is enhanced by relationships characterized by safety, predictability, and non judgmental acceptance. These qualities can come from human relationships, animal relationships, or both. The key is recognizing these needs and finding healthy ways to meet them. As we face life's inevitable losses and challenges, we don't have to navigate them alone. Whether that support comes from human relationships, animal companions, or both, the important thing is recognizing our fundamental need for connection and taking steps to nurture relationships that support our well being and capacity for healing. The bonds we form with companion animals remind us that healing happens in relationship, that presence is often more powerful than solutions, and that love, in all its forms, has the capacity to transform our experience of even the most difficult circumstances. In our next episode, we'll be exploring how these principles of attachment and emotional regulation apply to supporting children through loss and trauma. Until then, take care of yourselves, appreciate the relationships that sustain you, and remember that healing is always possible. This has been Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and thank you for joining me today.